Hi, this is Paul, and continued thoughts on this conversation. Part of what this conversation is between Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and Brett Weinstein and Douglas Murray is about his moral knowledge. And I've been talking about nouns and verbs and getting this from my friend. And at some point, I'm gonna probably talk more about him. I'd like him to come on the air with me, but at this point, he doesn't yet want to. But the main question is how should people live? Now, remember, Jordan Peterson approaches this that he says you can conceive of the world in two different ways. You can conceive of the world as a form for action, which is verbs doing among nouns or objects. And Sam Harris says we use reason to pursue well-being. And he construes the world more as a space with objects. There's a sense in which well-being begs the question of should. And in the conversation early on, remember Vancouver 1 begins and Jordan Peterson is building his project. And in a sense, everyone on stage can say, well, we want good and not bad. Well, there's something. Can we all agree on what good is and what bad is? So, yeah, we can agree that the Nazi extermination of people and the gulags, those were bad. We don't want that. Good. Well, we got that agreement. Well, can we get further than that? Use reason to pursue should. Well, the difficulty with that, as we've been talking about, is especially with respect to reason, should involves ends, and ends involve values, and good involves values. And so this is where Peterson and Sam Harris go in terms of talking about, can you derive values from facts and how? And Peterson says there are a priori structures that have developed over great periods of time, and we see objects through those structures, and those structures evaluate objects and the things that we're engaging with and put them into hierarchies. And Brett Weinstein talks about overcoming our assassin robot chimp program. And as we talked about before, as I'm kind of going through this, Peterson goes into Jane Goodall and the chimps. Implicit in these conversations, however, as I hear often, is a bias towards law. And the idea that is if we can detail out lists of rules, now these will be cognitive and conscious, we will follow them and then will yield well-being. So with the Kavanaugh debates, I sent out a tweet. Advice from 2018 to any of you college students thinking about a career in high office in the nation, despite 50 years of dismissing Christian morality as puritanical and repressive, and all of these things, including some comments Sam Harris made in this, you'd be best off only having sex after you're married and avoiding alcohol and other things. Just a word to the wise, okay? This assumes a high degree, however, of transparency and self-discipline. Why did young David Kavanaugh want to pose in his high school yearbook naming the kinds of things he named? Well, it could be that he did these things, or it could be that he was trying to gain status within an in-group by bragging about things he never did. Both of those are possibilities, and we know this about people because this is what people are like. People lie in order to gain status or brag about things that might be exaggerations or perhaps never happened in order to have status within a group that they are trying to stay within. People are not self-transparent, and people are not self-disciplined. The most self-aware of us know how poorly we are at these things. And this is the reason people go into therapy and have accountability groups and join 12-step programs, because truth be told, we are not transparent to ourselves. And this goes all the way back into antiquity, conversations about this, and we'll get into Jonathan Haidt in a few minutes, but the Apostle Paul, for example, in Romans 7, talks about the good I would do, I don't do. This is, and what I don't want to do, I do. And this is a common human experience, and religions have been talking about these experiences for a long time. Now, one way that we deal with is through law or rules. And the law approach is basically this, that there are laws or there are rules that we can come up with, and these are usually propositions that describe what we ought to do. The Ten Commandments are one of these, and Sam Harris in the debate, and I've heard him say this before, regularly suggests that if don't take slaves was one of the Ten Commandments, that would have been a good thing. And if the Bible were true, it would have that rule. And Brett Weinstein mentions, well, maybe one of the things that should have been in the Ten Commandments is don't split the atom, even though the people at that point had no idea what atoms were. But the law approach says if we consciously know the truth, we can consciously do the truth. And anybody who works in any kind of law or rules know that people are really bad at this. We almost always make laws about things we want to do but know we shouldn't do, and then we go ahead to break them. Sam Harris imagines that, well, maybe if the Bible had a Ten Commandments that said, thou shalt not keep slaves, then slavery wouldn't have happened. And I think that's a rather naive perspective. The assumption is that if you keep the rules, you will reap the reward. But many of us know that there are rewards that can be reaped by breaking the rules. What if you are alone? And this is where Sam Harris gets into his masturbation comments, because I assume he's imagining those will probably be mostly solitary experiences. What if others around you think they know a different truth? What if your rule says you shall not pick up wallets on the street because the owner might come back for them? The other rule says wallets on the street are found goods. You're, welcome to help yourself to the money. Or another rule might say you should first look for ID. If there's no ID in it, then the wallet is yours. Another rule might say you should put an ad in Craigslist that says found envelope with $100. If it's yours, please call da 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 da. Now, free speech, as we've talked about it, is the attempt to talk about it. So one of the ways that we can deal with these rules and the multiplicity of the rules and our difficulty with rules and continuing to evaluate rules and try to get better rules is to discuss the rules. And hopefully, as Jonathan Haidt makes note, many people are smarter than one people. And so if all of us use language together, hopefully we'll come up with more rules. But then again, have you ever talked to a human being? Actually, I just finished a conversation with Luke, and this was one of the topics that we talked about. He said, it is tremendously difficult for human beings to actually sit down and make progress in conversation. And if anything, these 4 talks between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris illustrate how difficult this is. What are people like? We have motivations, we get defensive, we have status that we're trying to play with respect to our speech, and we are selfish. And so even this dialogue-based remedy for our moral confusion, our lack of moral performance, is by no means a complete resolution to the disasters of our world. Now, and there's a lot of motivation that goes into this. Now, Sam Harris brings love into these debates, and I'll often tell people that imagine the world as 2 lines, and one is to love, and the other is to be loved. And I'm just, for the sake of this, defining love as something which should be very in the line of Sam Harris here. I've actually used this definition for a number of years. To love means to your well-being at my expense. That's what I would say to someone. I love you. I'm going to look out for your well-being, and it's going to cost me something. That is love. So there's 2 lines, to love and to be loved. And I often tell people there's no weight to love other people. Other people that want to be loved, that's pretty much anyone you lay eyes on. They want to be loved. Now, I don't mean that erotically or sexually. I mean that they would love it if you would do something good to them. And if it costs you something, that's even a greater demonstration of what love is. Now, there's a Brett Weinstein video on, I forget the name of it right now, on, it talks about zero-sum games. And in fact, I was in a conversation on Twitter today about anti-rivalry. And when I was listening to that anti-rivalry language, and if you're curious about that, you can find it on my Twitter stream. My Twitter handle is hard to figure out. It's Paul Vanderclay. So just in case you were wondering. But Not everything is a zero-sum game, and in that way, love is cheap and easy. And often if there's a context of affluence and material, um, you know, that's fairly easy. But many issues for us would have to deal with status and ego, and that's where this anti-rivalry conversation came in, based on a post by Andrew Sweeney that he just posted on Medium. Many issues for us have status or ego oriented, being validated, seen as right, esteemed, or all greatly prized, clutched and sought after. And we have a lot of motivations that go into our actions. And we might not even be terribly aware of these motivations, but usually other people are at least as aware of them or suspicious of them. You might not even have a motivation or be aware of a motivation, but another person who is in a context with you where there could potentially be some rivalry might suspect that there is a motive that would devalue the relationship. And again, C.S. Lewis talks about that with his Bulverisms. Now, Jonathan Haidt weighs in, and in his book, The Righteous Mind, one of the things that I was pondering, listening to these conversations between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, was how individualistic this is, and how free from context the imagined moral solution of Sam Harris is. It's kind of me and my rationality and the world of objects, and I am going to decide what is right for me and what is moral and immoral. But one of the things that we know is that morality is a highly communitarian thing. Jonathan Haidt says this: the new atheist model is based on the Platonic rational view of the mind, which is introduced in chapter 2 of his book, The Righteous Mind. Reason, or at least could be, the charioteer guiding the passions. And that's kind of this Platonic imagination of what a human being is. A human being in charge has his passions under rein, and so can employ the passions towards some reasoned end. Jonathan Haidt, Martin Luther, Paul Vanderklay are all deeply suspicious, quite frankly, of that position. I don't think it's true. I think actually the elephant and the rider are probably more true. In chapters 2, 3, and 4, however, I reviewed a great deal of evidence against the Platonic view in favor of the Humean view, in which reason, the rider, is a servant of the intuitions, or the elephant. And again, if you go past my last few videos, I've talked a little bit about this. But what I wanted to do in this video was look at some real life challenges, because one of the things that we deal with in terms of morality is orientation. This entire conversation about moral knowledge is a conversation about orientation. How do we know what's right, and how do we know what's wrong? Now, Sam Harris looks at the Bible and says, clearly it's wrong. I say, okay, Sam, let's back up the word clearly here. And why don't you tell me, on what basis are you coming to your judgment that this is wrong? Now, if you listen to Sam Harris sounds, move it away. I should maybe just keep this at my table. Sam Harris sounds pretty much like all of the youth that Christian Smith interviewed in his book Soul Searching, because according to Sam Harris, somehow morality is self-evident, and somehow well-being is self-evident, and all we need to do is apply reason and we will arrive at well-being. Well, this gets considerably harder in community, and in fact, believing, belonging, doing, there's a lot going on in terms of that belonging stuff. A lot of what the rider is doing is trying to make the elephant and the rider, the team, look good in front of the other pairs of elephants and riders. We are trying to gain status. And so what perhaps Brett Kavanaugh was doing as he was bragging in the yearbook, whatever he did with, this is the Renita alumni thing that he did in the yearbook, whatever he did or didn't do, all that chatter was about status. He wanted to be part of the in group. C.S. Lewis talks about the inner ring. So there's knowing the truth. Well, how can you know that which is good? What is good? Application, living the truth. So once in fact you know it, say, look, take the second table of the law and the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. Let's just take those. Those are about, pretty basic things. Well, you can commit adultery if you're really in love, and if you can steal if maybe they stole it first, and you can kill if maybe they had it coming, or there's some other justifying example. Living the truth is really difficult. Is truth only a noun or a verb plus a noun? Because actually, if you get into kind of this Greek and Hebrew conception of truth, Greek truth tends to be a little closer to, say, Rationality Rules and Sam Harris in terms of some kind of relationship or correspondence to something. In Hebrew, truth is much more something that you live. It's much more of an active thing in terms of the Hebrew conception of the world. And then when we're in community, we are blind to most of ourselves. And we're just really acting out our programs and, well, and all of the gods that have been built into us. And I've talked about that in previous videos. We are socialized by these parental authorities with all kinds of oughts within us. And again, this was exactly what Christian Smith discovered when he did this massive project of researching young people and asking, what is moral? Well, they all seem to know what's moral, and they all learned it from their parents, and it's something that's pretty much just self-evident. That's what they imagined. But we are socialized into these kinds of things, and there are actions and assumptions within our families and within our societies. And as long as we don't actually try to live with someone else or have an in-depth conversation with someone else, we can look around and say, well, we all believe the same thing, until you actually begin to talk to people and discover, well, we don't all believe the same thing. And we all have different ideas of what you should do when should you go over for dinner empty-handed, or if they invited you, can you just show up and eat? What are the rules? Well, clearly, and so then you write in the newspaper and the etiquette person will tell you what you should do. One of the things that is amazing me in our present cultural context is how 100 years of psychology and sociology is so quickly forgotten, because we've just spent the last 100 years trying to asserting that we are formed creatures, that we are the products of our environment, we're the products of nature and nurture. And suddenly we're in a cultural moment when we say, I'm not the product of anything. Well, that's again leads us back to naive young people for whom everything is just simply self-evident. That we sit in the middle, and this is something like Piaget's equilibrated state. We are the products of our parents and our siblings, of our grandparents, of our great-grandparents, and in fact, we are in the stream of producing, perhaps, if you reproduce, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and and then and then we are impacted by family, friends, our thought tribe, our religious allies, our thought and religious traditions, our neighbors, our city, our state, ethnic group, and nation. And this gets applied by Jordan Peterson when he talks about this in terms of the equilibrated state, where if something is good or something works, it should work for me, and it should work for me and my children and me and my parents and me and my family and me and my neighbors and me and my city, and out and out and out and out. And the more levels for which something works, the more layers, we can say in a sense, the better that thing is. And what you very quickly discover is that if you're actually doing things with other people, this is not so easy to negotiate all these things. And this, again, is why we talk. Now, we are conscious beings watching and responding to the environment in terms of well-being and desire. So we're both in this context of the equilibrated state. We're talking all of these things. Well, your parents say, well, you should do this. Well, that doesn't, there's a generation gap perhaps, and that doesn't, use a certain kind of language, that doesn't feel authentic to my experience, so I'm going to do something else. So then you do that, And you say, well, I don't think marriage is important, so I'm just going to, oh, we're having a kid. Great. Well, you not marrying and you exchanging partners might not feel good to a kid whose mom is now over there and you're over here. And your kid would have preferred if you had actually married and given them stability over the 18 years that they will be dependent on you, really more like 21 when you include college, if they go to college, if you're the kind of parent that actually helps your child in college as the government assumes you will. So right away you say, well, everything is self-evident, but everybody's self-evidence is not the same. And so this is why you have a conversation about what is moral. Now, we might imagine that Sam Harris, in his morality, in this kind of this timeless, contextless, rational vision, will be able to say, well, here is morality. Well, that's an interesting thing for a person who lives in a world of objects, because you don't just walk up to morality and pick it up, like in fact you can pick up a book. So conscious beings have been watching and responding to their environment in terms of well-being and desires. And so hard structures develop, snake detection systems. Soft structures develop, thought, culture, laws, norms. Children, if a parent, children tend to take in what their parents do more than what their parents say. These become agents in our world. These norms, we begin to experience them as agents, and this is in a sense God or the gods, that which selects, that which, you can look at Jordan Peterson's axiomatic God for this. We personify them with our speech, and in fact, pretty much even the most ardent materialists personify these gods with their speech. Our genes want to blank, and they have difficulty expressing this kind of idea in almost any other way. The next moment they'll say, yeah, genes aren't people they don't actually want, but your genes want you to do this. So then you've got, again, Jane Goodall and the chimps, or the gods want you to do this. Now, here's the difficulty for materialists. Find morality in a space of objects. From the beginning, Jordan Peterson's conceptual starting point, which is a forum for action, is already an improvement over a space for objects when you begin with the question, what should we do? From the beginning, Jordan Peterson's conceptual starting point has the inherent advantage of understanding verbs and actions when talking about morality. Morality is not a fact like a chair or a table. If you'd actually have to ask Sam Harris, what exactly is morality? Well, it's what we should do. Okay, but is that a fact? And now what we saw with Sam Harris in the talk was that Sam can turn anything into a fact, which is terribly convenient if you need to live in this world, but then he shouldn't really hop back over the line and say, oh no, that's not a fact. You can call an observable action a fact, but the value should, which is what we're looking for, isn't obvious from the fact, and that's Jordan Peterson's big point. Now I'm going to play a little bit of the monkey business here when Jordan Peterson takes them off the trail, and just notice how the language goes.
Another thing that I wanted to just point out obliquely, and then I want to return to outlining maybe where we agree, is that one of the things that was really shocking to me, I would say, was my reading of what was originally Jane Goodall's discovery about chimp behavior, because there was this idea that was really rooted in Rousseauian thinking that the reason that people committed atrocities in the service of their group identity, let's say their tribal identity, was because culture had corrupted us. So it was a uniquely human thing. But then, of course, Goodall showed in the 1970s that the chimps at Gombe, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, yep, would go on raiding parties, right? And so there'd be like 4 or 5 adolescent chimps, usually male, sometimes with a female in there. They would patrol the borders of their territory. If they found an interloper on the border, near the border, from another troop, even if it was a member of their troop that had emigrated, so to speak, and that they had had some history with, they would tear them to pieces. And of course, that was shocking to Goodall. But my understanding is she had some trepidations about publishing it, although she did. But then that's been noted repeatedly in other forms of chimp behavior. So, see, I've been really interested in the commission of atrocity in the service of belief. And
see, right away, commission of atrocity in the service of belief. What are these beliefs? And, you know, every time Jordan Peterson gets asked, do you believe in God? He's like, that word belief, I'm not ready to go with you there with that word, because he sees how complicated beliefs are, especially with respect to action. And so that's why he acts as if.
And it's tempting to pin that, say, on dogma and then to associate that with religious dogma. I think that's all tempting. But the fact that chimps do it shows that it can't be a consequence of something like religious belief, unless you're willing to say that the reason that chimps commit atrocity in the service of their troop and their territory is because chimps are religious. And so they're not religious, and they don't really hold a secular totality.
I wonder if chimps had bombed the World Trade Center, if Sam would say chimp religion did it.
Totalitarian viewpoint, but they still act out the atrocity element that's characteristic of human behavior. And so to me, that makes the problem deeper than one of mere, let's say, surface statements about metaphysics.
Well, obviously the problem of primate aggression, which we've inherited along with the chimps, is deeper, or at least different, than the problem of religious violence or totalitarian political structures that get the worst out of people. So, I mean, we have these primate capacities that we have to correct for, and we're busily trying to correct for almost everything that we've been evolved to do. I mean, we don't like the state of nature for good reason.
Every time I hear that, I think that is such an interesting thing to say. Because again, you have the problem, this gets into C.S. Lewis's Miracles. Well, is there something above nature? And C.S. Lewis in Miracles says, you know, if you're a naturalist or materialist, you think this is the whole show. And everything we are is a product of the whole show. So, but yet in your language, you can't make that work. We have to somehow transcend nature. Now we have to somehow figure out that which is super to nature to apply it to ourselves. Now, all agree that this is something we want to do, unless we're in the food aisle in Costco and we're looking for organic food, or we're working on a paleo diet. But whose system better accounts for this? So then we look for moral agreement. We should not kill strangers or cousins who infringe on our territory. So we look at the Jane Goodall chimps and we say, this is immoral what the chimps are doing. Now, we don't actually apply this to chimps because we don't consider them moral agents. But let's assume the chimps developed this behavior as an adaptive survival technique. And the adaptive survival technique makes a certain degree of sense. You don't want other chimps competing for the food or the females or the other things. And one of the ways you do that is by defining a territory and protecting your territory and enforcing the territory. So let's assume that human beings transcended this instinct or this structure as a survival technique. Well, this makes sense because one of the things about human beings is that unlike chimps, who are probably mostly focused in terms of their territoriality on food and sex and security, human beings set up multiple hierarchies. And while we certainly have interests of food and security, and although our mating is different from chimps, there are other issues that we would have, but also other possibilities. And so one of the things that we could say happened with human beings is that semi-permeable borders were seen as superior to impermeable borders, rules with no exceptions that chimps enforce with violence. So semi-permeable borders. Chimps have a very limited number of hierarchies food and reproduction and security, let's say, we have knowledge hierarchies. We watch each other for threats. We can get other things from other people. Knowledge, nouns, and verbs that improve our capacity for survival, pleasure, and status. So here's something that, in a sense, we are transcending nature, might call this supernatural, in not doing as chimps do, but doing something else. Now, what I wanted to do in this video is play some of this book, 1493, because this is a fascinating book on many different levels. One of the most important borders that we've known in human history was people coming over from Europe, crossing the border into the Americas. And we know that massive number of human beings in the Americas died because of disease, quite unintentionally. But the interchange between these two groups was noteworthy. Now, one might argue that the inhabitants of the Americas would have been better off organizing and killing any Europeans that came into their land, acting as chimps do, rather than practicing semi-permeable borders. Why didn't the population act like chimps? Did they have the means? Well, you can read Guns, Germs, and Steel, which goes into some of this, but I'm going to play some of this and go through this. And now, as I play it, I want you to think about morality. I want you to think about the kind of thing morality is, especially with respect to a survivability end or telos that Peterson and I think all three of them share, and ask, are these people acting morally?
Strange Land. On May 14, 1607, 3 small ships anchored in the James River at the southern periphery of Chesapeake Bay. In movies and textbooks, they are often depicted as arriving in a pristine forest of ancient trees, small bands of Indians gliding, silent as ghosts, beneath the canopy. Implicit in this view is the common description of the colonists as settlers, as if the land was unsettled before they came on the scene. In fact, the English ships landed in the middle of a small but rapidly expanding Indian empire called Senacomaco. 3 decades before, Senacomaco had comprised 6 small, separate clusters of villages. By the time the foreigners came from overseas, its paramount leader, Powhatan, had tripled its size to about 8,000 square miles. Senacomaco stretched from Chesapeake Bay to the Fall Line, the bluffs at the edge of the Appalachian Plateau. In its scores of villages lived more than 14,000 people. Europeans would have been impressed by these numbers. Michael Williams, a historical geographer at Oxford, argued that the eastern U.S. forest may have been more populous in 1600 than even densely settled parts of Western Europe. The ruler of this land was known by multiple names and titles, a hallmark of kings everywhere. Powhatan, the name used most often by the colonists, was also the name of the village in which he was born. Wary, politically shrewd, ruthless when needed, Powhatan was probably in his 60s when the English landed. Well beaten with many cold and stormy winters, according to colonist Strachey, but still of a tall stature and clean limbs. His capital of Werowocomoco, King's House, was on the north bank of the York River, in a little bay where 3 streams come together. The York runs more or less parallel to the James and a few miles to its north. Projecting from the shore was a peninsula dominated by a low rise, 25 feet at its highest point, which held most of the village's houses. Behind it, separated by a double moat from the west of Werowocomoco, was a second, smaller hill with several structures at its base that combined the function of temples, armories, and treasure houses. Generally closed to commoners, they contained the preserved bodies of important chiefs and priests, mounted on scaffolds and ringed by emblems of wealth and power. Atop the hill was the biggest structure in Senacomaco, a great windowless barrel vault, perhaps 150 feet long, its walls made of overlapping sheets of chestnut bark, with gargoyle-like statues at each corner. At the far end, lighted by torches, was the royal chamber. Inside, the sovereign greeted visitors from a raised, pillow-covered divan, surrounded by wives and advisers, long gray hair tumbling over his shoulders, ropes of fat pearls descending from his neck. Confronted with this regal spectacle, colonist John Smith was awed. The Indian men, who generally had better diets than the English, seemed like giants, with deep voices sounding from them, as a voice in a vault. Sitting in the center, Powhatan himself, Smith thought, had such a majesty as I cannot express. To the English, Powhatan was a recognizable figure, the king of a small domain, with the lofty bearing that they expected from royalty. Any strangeness adhered not to the man in the foreground of the picture, but the background against which he appeared, the fields, forests, and rivers of Tsenacomico. It could hardly have been otherwise. Chesapeake Bay was shaped by ecological and social forces unknown to the colonists. Speaking broadly, the most important ecological force was the region's different tally of plant and animal species. The social force, just as consequential, was the Indians' different land management practices. By a quirk of biological history, the pre-Columbian Americas had few domesticated animals. No cattle, horses, sheep, or goats graced its farmlands. Most big animals are tameable in the sense that they can be trained to lose their fear of people, but only a few species are readily domesticable, that is, willing to breed easily in captivity.
Now, this difference and the lack of domesticatable animals is attributed by Jared Diamond and others as part of the reason that the inhabitants of the Americas had no immunity to a lot of the diseases that the Europeans had. And actually, in this book in 1493, he'll go through quite a bit more of what happened with malaria and how that then factored into the enslavement of Africans,
Thereby letting humans select for useful characteristics. In all of history, humankind has been able to domesticate only 25 mammals, a dozen or so birds, and possibly a lizard. Just 6 of these creatures existed in the Americas, and they played comparatively minor roles. The dog, eaten in Central and South America and used for labor in the far north, the guinea pig, llama, and alpaca, which reside in the Andes, the turkey, raised in Mexico and the U.S. Southwest, the Muscovy duck, native to South America despite its name, and, some say, the iguana, farmed in Mexico and Central America. In recent years, advanced techniques have let researchers domesticate a few previously undomesticable species in laboratory settings. The silver fox is the most well-known example. In all previous history, though, only about 40 large animals were domesticated. That figure does not include domesticated insects, like the European honeybee and the Mexican cochineal, cultivated as a source of red dye. The lack of domestic animals had momentous consequences. In a country without horses, donkeys, and cattle, the only source of transportation and labor was the human body. Compared to England, Tsenacomico had slower communications, no galloping horses, a dearth of plowed fields, no straining oxen, and pastures, no grazing cattle, and fewer and smaller roads, no carriages to accommodate. Battles were fought without cavalry, winters endured without wool, logs skidded through the forest without oxen. Distances loomed larger when people had to walk from place to place. Indeed, in terms of the time required for Powhatan's orders to reach his minions, Tsenacomico may have been the size of England itself. It was much less populous, of course. Just as most Europeans lived in small farm villages, most of Powhatan's people, the Powhatan Indians as the newcomers called them, lived in settlements of a few hundred inhabitants surrounded by large tracts of cleared land, fields of maize and former maize fields. The villages clustered along 3 rivers, the Rappahannock, York, and James,
pause here,
in England to tobacco. Sir Francis Drake probably brought the plant to the nation in the previous decade. He had acquired it on his round-the-world expedition, but it wasn't widely known until Roanoke colonists returned with strange, fiery clay tubes at their lips. "In a short time," one courtly eyewitness moaned, "many men everywhere, with insatiable desire and greediness, sucked in the stinking smoke." Despite this dismal record, the Virginia Company believed it worth trying again. At its inception, the company consisted of two investor groups, one in Plymouth and one in London. The Plymouth group focused on what is now New England and quickly launched a colony on the coast of Maine. It disintegrated within months, and the Plymouth investors threw in the towel. The London group set its sights on Chesapeake Bay, and in practice took over the entire venture. Its ships set sail from London on December 20th, 1606. Although Roanoke had been wiped out by its Indian neighbors, the Virginia Company directors reserved their fears for distant Spain. They ordered the colonists, their employees in today's terms, to reduce the chance of detection by Spanish ships by locating the colony at least 100 miles from the ocean. The instructions didn't mention that this location might already be inhabited. True, the directors viewed conflict with the Indians as unavoidable, but they viewed the conflict as a problem mainly because they feared Indians would guide and assist any nation that shall come to invade you. That is, they worried about Senacomico not because they feared its citizens would attack the English, but because they feared it would help Spain attack the English. For this reason, the directors told the colonists to take great care not to offend the naturals, naturals being a then common term for native people.
Pay attention to that word.
Term for native people. Jamestown was the result. All the good upriver land was already occupied by Indian villages. As a result, the newcomers, Tassantasses, strangers, the Indians called them, ended up selecting the most upstream uninhabited ground they could find. Their new home was 50 miles from the mouth of the James. It was a peninsula near a bend in the river, at a place where the current cut so close to the shore that ships could be moored to the trees. Unfortunately for the Tassantasses, no Indians lived on the peninsula because it was not a good place to live. The English were like the last people moving into a subdivision. They ended up with the least desirable property. The site was boggy and mosquito-ridden. Colonists could get water from the James, but it was not always potable. During the late summer, the river falls as much as 15 feet. No longer pushed back by the flow of fresh water, the salty water of the estuary spreads upstream, stopping right around Jamestown. Because the colonists had arrived in the midst of a multi-year drought, the summer flow was especially feeble and the concentration of salt water especially high. The saltwater boundary traps sediments and organic wastes from upstream, which meant that the English were drinking the foulest water in the James. "Full of slime and filth," complained Percy, the future colony president. The obvious solution, digging a well, was not tried for more than 2 years. It was of little help. Chesapeake Bay is the remains of a huge 35-million-year-old meteor crater. The impact-fractured rock at the mouth of the bay lets in the sea, contaminating the groundwater with salt. Few Indian groups lived in the saltwater wedge, presumably for just that reason. Jamestown was bordered and undergirded by bad water. That bad water, the geographer Carville V. Earle argued, led to typhoid, dysentery, and perhaps salt poisoning. By January 1608, 8 months after landing, only 38 English were left alive.
Okay, let's talk about morality. What does morality look like in this story? What did the Powhatan owe the English? Death? Food? Land? Were they to say, well, it's obviously you shouldn't live there because it's a bad place to live and you're all going to die drinking bad water, and we all know this, which is why we don't live where you live? Or should they act like chimps and run them off? How do you tell? Was the Bible helpful for the English? were the English using the Bible? Now, it's interesting when you look at the different colonies, and Sam Harris never gets into much history with this. You could have an interesting comparison between the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts versus the Jamestown colony, and how those two cultures developed, also with respect to the their various the Indian communities that they were engaging with. Well, let's keep going because pretty quickly, why didn't the Indians run them off? Why didn't they act like chimps? Was that some kind of enlightened self-interest? Was it morality?
Live. Paradoxically, the colony's desperation was its salvation. Powhatan apparently couldn't bring himself to regard the starving Tassantassas as a threat. Certain that he could oust the English at any time, he allowed them to occupy their not-so-valuable real estate as long as they provided valuable trade goods: guns, axes, knives, mirrors, glass beads, and copper sheets, the last of which the Indians prized much as Europeans prized gold ingots.
So what's happening there? Well, they're prizing these things. They're seeing opportunity. They have semi-permeable borders because they have multiple hierarchies that they are working, and they don't see the English as much of a threat. They don't know what's on the other side of the ocean from the English. There have been little bits of contact between them. None of them obviously understand disease, but there's way more going on than what any of them can know.
Gold ingots. After abducting John Smith, this subtle old fox, as Percy called him, learned enough from his captive to conclude that the profit from trade with the Tassantassas tomorrow was worth giving them grain today. He sent the foreigner back to Jamestown in January 1608 with enough maize to keep his few remaining companions alive for a while. From Powhatan's point of view, it was a good bet, suggests Rowntree, the anthropologist of Senacomico. If the English tried to overstay their welcome, he could simply withhold their food, and the invasion would implode on its own. Confidence born of ignorance, the University of Missouri historian J. Frederick Faust has noted, characterized the initial attitudes of both English and Indians toward each other.
So was that a moral strategy? Was that what he was thinking? Was it reasonable?
Indians toward each other. After his return from captivity, John Smith took charge of Jamestown. Because he controlled food negotiations with Powhatan, the colony's men of consequence swallowed their displeasure. In any case, they could hardly point to a record of success. That spring, Smith ordered the survivors to plant crops. They would have rather looked for gold, and rebuild the colony fort. They had accidentally burned it down.
You can see a variety of hierarchies working in these sentences.
They burned it down. He himself continued to explore Chesapeake Bay, persuading himself there was a good hope that it stretched to the Pacific. All the while, Smith negotiated with Powhatan for food. He wanted to dribble out enough knives, hatchets, and iron pots to Senacomico to get the necessary grain shipments, but not enough to saturate the Indian demand for English goods.
So Smith is playing his own game.
English goods. Complicating his task, English demand kept rising. 2 more convoys in the spring and fall of 1608 increased the number of mouths to about 200. Like any good businessman, Powhatan responded to the rising demand by raising maize prices. He asked for guns and swords rather than hand tools. Smith refused, fearing the consequences of arming the Indians. Powhatan responded by cutting side deals for weapons with Jamestown residents who chafed at Smith's autocratic rule. And he kept the pressure on Smith by allowing his men to pick off stragglers outside Jamestown.
And what's lovely about this entire story is that, well, what is morality here? Is it a set of rules? Is there a universal morality that you imagine can be applied in laws here? What would be the specifics of those laws? Thou shalt not sell arms to Indians. Thou shalt not feed hungry Englishmen. It's Was it moral to settle in the Americas? Why was there not a 10 commandment against that? Was it moral to allow Europeans to settle? Was it moral to allow the Europeans to live as long as they provided the benefits to your own tribal population? Was reason involved? Can reason be employed without valued ends? Now, what were the valued ends that these individual groups are looking for? Well, there's multiples of them. There are economic ends, not so much in this story with the Spanish and with the Puritans. There are more religious ends. Well, what is actually religion? The English had their religion. The Powhatan had their religion. Is religion just projections into the sky? Now, to a degree, Peterson, Weinstein, and Harris all agree that perhaps the kinds of things you find in the Bible, or the kinds of things that were practiced and inherited via stories — the Powhatan didn't have writing — was an accumulation of the ages represented in stories, laws, saying, practices, traditions, in order to guide people towards well-being as they assume it should be. Now, as you know, for the colonists, for the pilgrims who came over to Massachusetts, they were trying to set up in a sense, the kingdom of heaven on earth. Now, in a sense, a new creation. And well, the native population was, on one hand, necessary, because you see some similar dynamics there. The Europeans come over and they don't know how to grow food here. Now, what 1493 will demonstrate is that what happens is not only do the Europeans bring themselves over, but they bring the farming ways of Europe over, and actually North America gets terraformed into Europe. But you have the problem of context with respect to morality. And so you might ask, would a series of laws deduced from facts actually be the most helpful means of communicating morality? And I would argue, first of all, whereas, let's use the Bible for an example, whereas the Bible certainly has laws in it, the book is really not that many laws. The book is mostly narrative and poetry, and then in the New Testament, some letters. And there are certainly ethical injunctions, moral injunctions, but the way the Bible communicates is nothing like adding new things to the 10 Commandments. It just simply doesn't work that way, because contexts don't work that way. Now listen to Sam as he wrestles with the stuff that Jordan Peterson is throwing at him.
In viewpoint, but they still act out the atrocity element that's characteristic of human behavior. And so to me, that makes the problem deeper than one of mere, let's say, surface statements about metaphysics.
Well, obviously the problem of primate aggression, which we've inherited along with the chimps, is deeper, or at least different, than the problem of religious violence or totalitarian political structures that get the worst out of people. So, we have these primate capacities that we have to correct for, and we're busily trying to correct for almost everything that we've been evolved to do. We don't like the state of nature for good reason, and virtually everything that's good about human life is born of our, I would argue, culture-based and highly intelligent and necessary effort to mitigate what is in fact natural for us. And there's nothing more natural than tribal violence, which of the sort that you're describing in chimps.
Okay, so then it also seems like we agree that the core element of tribal alliance, which would have its roots, say, in the chimpanzee proclivity to, or its analog in the chimpanzee proclivity to identify with the dominance hierarchy of the troop, is something that's a source of the proclivity for human social aggression, that's independent of its, at least independent of any obvious religious substrate. So there are other reasons for group belief and the commission of atrocity that can't be directly attributed to religious dogma.
Yeah, but and what most worries me about religion, I would say, obviously religion can channel these primate urges in unhappy ways. So you can get tribal violence that gets amplified by religious dogmatism, and that should trouble everyone. But it's not unique to religion. It's also nationalism, and it's racism, and it's all other kinds of dogmatism.
And it's just plain survival.
But what most worries me are those cases where clearly good people who are not necessarily captured by tribalism per se are doing the unthinkable based purely on religious doctrines that they believe wholeheartedly without good evidence. So you have the person who joins ISIS who wasn't even Muslim before they converted, 16 months ago, and they go all the way down the rabbit hole to the most doctrinaire, most committed, most uncompromising view of just how you have to live in this world if you're going to be Muslim. And they join ISIS based on the idea that salvation only goes one way, and that dying in defense of the one true faith is the best thing that can happen to you. There's no question that there are individuals who have made that journey. In fact, there are individuals by the thousands who have made that journey. And there are far more benign versions of that. There are people who just waste their lives, I would argue, converting to whatever the belief system is, and just wasting a lot of time worrying about hell or worrying about the fact that their child is gay and the creator of the universe doesn't approve of that. And so there are all kinds of suffering that strike me as truly unnecessary, born not of, again, ape-like urges, but ideas that any rational person would, if believed, would follow to that same terminus.
Okay, well, let's look at a really radical conversion. Let's look at Pocahontas. Now, one thing that's beautiful about this example of the Europeans coming over to the Americas was that these are enormously distinct groups of people. There's very little that these people have in common in terms of their shared backstory. These two groups are separated by oceans, and there are almost no cultural links between them. And in fact, their biology is so separated that the Europeans coming over are involuntary hosts to microorganisms and then later to plants and animals that are going to completely destroy the world of the natural inhabitants. And you might say, well, how on earth could a human being cross this, and how could this work? Now, it gets very interesting because there is no sanction given in the Bible to kidnapping. And in fact, there are rules against kidnapping in the Bible. But that doesn't stop Europeans from kidnapping. And it doesn't stop the Native Americans from kidnapping. Kidnapping and holding hostages is a very common, very universal thing, which is, I would say, probably, it's in a competition with the brutality of slavery. Did the natives not have a religion and morality too? They had plenty of religion, and they had morality. Well, which was more governed by reason, the Native Americans or the Europeans? Now, almost implicit in Sam Harris's schema is a progressivism where you might imagine that because the Europeans had more technology, and significant technology, and I don't just mean steel and navigational technology and weaponry and animal husbandry and all of those things, they also had writing and literature. I mean, European was, well, we would use advanced, that puts them on a spectrum, from the Native Americans. But it's very interesting how these morality games go in terms of trying to compare the morality between these two people, because, of course, Rousseau and others will wade in and say, oh, no, these are noble savages. Well, that doesn't really work. And in other videos, Peterson will talk about the different competing ways to interpret all of the facts on the ground in terms of who these very strange people are coming over. And the story of Pocahontas becomes a very interesting one. So things continue to develop in the colonies, and more English come over, and the vast majority of them die of starvation because they have all kinds of problems. Mostly people are coming over not to farm, but because they're looking to turn a quick buck and they're looking for gold and they're looking for a passage to the Pacific so they can get to China and to make money. And nobody wants to work and nobody wants to plant food and they don't know how to plant food and they're on all the worst land. And the Powhatan are kind of keeping an eye on them and they're getting goods from them and they're trying to manage the situation. And they believe that at some point they'll be able to get rid of the English. And then we get into the story of Pocahontas, who is the daughter of the Powhatan chief, and things begin to take some interesting turns with her story.
Pocahontas probably did not save John Smith when he was captured in 1608, but she did help save Jamestown by marrying the widower John Rolfe 6 years later. Evidence suggests she was a curious, mischievous child, one who, like all children in Senacomico, went without clothing until puberty. After Smith's return from captivity, Pocahontas visited Jamestown, colonist Strachey wrote afterward. The colony's young men turned cartwheels with her, falling on their hands, turning their heels upwards, whom she would follow, and wheel so herself naked as she was all the fort over. Her real name was Matauka. Pocahontas was a teasing nickname that meant something like Little Hellion. The Tasantasas liked the girl, but not enough to prevent them from using her as a hostage. After Smith's departure, when Powhatan had again brought the English to the brink of annihilation, the colony's new leaders decided to counterattack. They put Jamestown under strict martial law. One colonist who stole several pints of oatmeal was chained to a tree until he starved to death, divided the men into military companies, and sent out expeditions to bring Senacomico to heel. Attacking without warning,
Now, was this chaining a man to the tree to starve to death a function of religion, or was it a function of necessity?
Without warning, the colonists razed native villages up and down the James. The Indians repeatedly struck back, picking off colonists one by one, forcing them to retreat behind Jamestown's palisade, where they were claimed by hunger and disease. It was a classic guerrilla war stalemate. The Tasantasas could win every battle, but never obtain a decisive victory. Powhatan's troops could always retreat into the hinterland, then reappear to deadly effect, arrows rushing from the trees in a sudden cloud. Yet Powhatan could not finish off the Tasantasas either. He could make the colonists so afraid to venture outside that they couldn't harvest their own crops. But as long as London was willing to keep shipping replacement supplies and replacement people, the Indians too could not win. Both sides were exhausted by March 1613, when Jamestown's military commander, Thomas Dale, ordered a subordinate to trick the teenage Pocahontas into coming aboard an English ship. Then they sailed away with her. Regarding the young woman as having noble blood, Dale put her under comfortable house arrest at the home of the colony's minister.
Now, was this whole idea about noble blood, is this from the Bible? Or is this from the other cultural traditions that the English maintain?
Minister. Meanwhile, he sent a ransom note to Powhatan. To get back his daughter, he would have to return all the swords, guns, and metal tools he treacherously had stolen, along with all the English prisoners of war. For 3 months, Powhatan refused to negotiate with people he regarded as criminals. Finally, he sent back a handful of English captives with an offer: 500 bushels of maize for the girl. The guns and swords could not be returned, he said, because they had been lost or stolen. Dale scoffed at this claim. Communications ceased for another 8 months, during which time some of the freed English captives ran back to the Indians. They preferred Senacomico, with its foreign culture and language, to Jamestown, with its martial law and famine. Determined to end the standoff, Dale led Rolfe and 150 musket-wielding Tasantasas in March 1614 to meet Powhatan. In an angry standoff, several hundred native troops faced Dale's men on the banks of the York River. With both sides fearing a battle that would inflict many casualties, England and Senacomico finally began active parley. Rolfe was on the English negotiating team. Senacomico was represented by Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough, the man who had seized John Smith in the swamp. Over 2 days, they put together an informal pact. Perhaps surprising, a key tenet was that Pocahontas would not return home. After her abduction, Pocahontas had been, one colonist reported, exceeding pensive and discontented. In addition, one assumes she was bewildered by the Tassantassas, with their unwieldy clothes, their practice of confining women to the home and garden, their strangely rigid eating habits. At home, people simply dipped into the stew pot when hungry. But over time, her attitude changed. Perhaps she was angered by her father's initial refusal to ransom her. Perhaps she liked being treated royally by the English. In her father's house, she was but one of many children from many wives. Perhaps she thought that by staying with the English, she could end the war, with its intermittent eruptions of atrocity. Perhaps she simply fell in love with John Rolfe, whom she met while she was in captivity. In any case, she agreed to stay in Jamestown as his bride. Nobody cared that Pocahontas was already married. Because she was still childless, Rowntree says, native custom allowed her to sunder the marital bond at any time. And the English were willing to overlook savage marriages. They were unchristian and therefore non-existent. In consequence, both natives and newcomers could treat Pocahontas's wedding to Rolfe as a de facto ceasefire, a timely and face-saving method of ending the war without capitulation, a written treaty, or a formal winner, as Faust put it in his History of the Strife.
So there you go. So how is morality playing with this? Pocahontas has this massive conversion. Conversion seems to be something that Sam Harris thinks only goes one way. This is why, in some sense, Sam Harris is a hyper-dogmatic atheist, because, well, he acts just like religious dogmatics do. But what's happening here with Pocahontas? Was it moral to capture her? Was her then decision to stay an immoral decision? How on earth can you actually manage morality in all of this situation? Yet everyone there, we would imagine, who is thinking about these situations would have moral notions and ideas and feelings about all of the events that are going on. Now, we, from our cultural position, look back and we pass moral judgment on things, and that seems easy for us, but then again, our morality is self-evident, as we might imagine.
Of the strife. Opechancanough used the suspension of hostilities to take the levers of power from his brother. Powhatan retired in about 1615 and died 3 years later. Unyielding and methodical, opposed to the Tassantassas from the day of their arrival, Opechancanough manipulated Jamestown into attacking his native rivals, augmenting his empire even as the English domain expanded.
So who's using who?
Determined to understand his enemy, the new ruler infiltrated his people into Jamestown. Working in English homes, trading with English ships, and serving in English militias, the Indians studied the ways of the foreigners. Opechancanoug's men acquired a stockpile of guns and trained themselves to use them. The colonists were blithely unaware of Opechancanoug's schemes. Nonetheless, they initiated, all unintentionally, a devastating countermeasure, the Columbian Exchange. The constant flow of ships to Virginia brought with them an entire suite of new species, opening what would become a multi-level ecological assault. One of the most potent weapons was tobacco. Even at the height of the war, John Rolfe had been experimenting with N. tabacum. King James I had initially excoriated smoking as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, and harmful to the brain. He thought about banning it, but changed his mind. The perpetually cash-short monarch had discovered that tobacco could be taxed. English smokers were relieved, but not happy. The Spaniards kept raising prices. Much as crack cocaine is an inferior, cheaper version of powdered cocaine, Virginia tobacco was of lesser quality than Caribbean tobacco, but also not nearly as expensive. Like crack, it was a wild commercial success. Within a year of its arrival, Jamestown colonists were paying off debts in London with little bags of the drug. The ceasefire with Powhatan let colonists expand production explosively. By 1620, Jamestown was shipping as much as 50,000 pounds a year. 3 years later, the figure had almost tripled. Within 40 years, Chesapeake Bay, the Tobacco Coast as it later became known, was exporting 25 million pounds a year. Individual farmers were making profits of as much as 1,000% on their initial investment.
What's amazing about the book 1493 is that essentially it's a story of our desires run wild. It's silver, it's tobacco, it's sugar. These are all really basic drugs that we're pretty used to now. But when these hit the rest of the world, whoosh, they went.
1,000%. And all that was needed was sun, water, and soil. The sums skyrocketed if farmers could afford servants. Laborers' annual pay was about £2, but they could grow 100 pounds or even 200 pounds of tobacco in that time. It was an object demonstration of the power of economic order to focus the human mind. The Tassantassas whom John Smith had to order into their fields at gunpoint now became intent on wringing tobacco from the soil. Newcomers poured in, grabbed some land, and planted N. tabacum. English-style farms spread like rumors up and down the James and York rivers. So many colonists poured in that the company realized they could not be controlled entirely from across the ocean and created an elected council to resolve disputes, the first representative body in colonial North America. Its opening session lasted from July 30th to August 4th, 1619. Barely 3 weeks later, a Dutch pirate ship landed at Jamestown. In its hold was 20 and odd Negroes, slaves taken by the pirates from a Portuguese slave ship destined for Mexico. About 30 more showed up in another ship a few days later. In their hurry to extract tobacco profits, the Tassantassas had been clamoring for more workers. The Africans had arrived at harvest time. Without a second thought, colonists bought the Africans in exchange for the food the pirates needed for the return trip to Europe. Legally speaking, the 20 and odd Africans may not have been slaves. Their status is unclear. Nevertheless, they were not volunteers. Their purchase was a landmark in the road to slavery. Within weeks of each other, Jamestown had inaugurated 2 of the future United States' most long-lasting institutions, representative democracy and chattel slavery.
Now, if Sam Harris were in Jamestown, how would he feel about slavery? Would it be so obvious to him then? What is not obvious to us now? One of the things that if you look at the history of slavery, you realize economically, probably the only way if you were the book will go on into malaria and describe why, even though indentured servants from England and Ireland would have been far better workers beneath the Mason-Dixon line, they died like crazy because of malaria, which came from Europe and Africa. And who didn't die in droves and could be employed as labor? Slaves. Slaves are lousy. Human beings make lousy slaves because we're way too smart, we're way too rebellious, but they didn't die like the Europeans, including the owners, died. Now, it's certainly easy to sit back and cast aspersions at ancient years and say, oh, those horrible people owned slaves. 200 years from now, what are the people going to say about us? We don't even know. Will it be, oh, well, someone should have put in the Ten Commandments, don't invent the internal combustion engine because you will spew CO2 into the atmosphere, or don't kill the whales, or don't fix nitrogen and mess up the nitrogen cycle, or chances are we don't know. So much for figuring out morality in this newfangled rational way. They were working on morality in all of their own ways. Now, I'm not a relativist, but what I'm saying is that Morality is a far more complicated thing than I think Sam Harris gives any indication for. Let's keep going with the story because it's a great story.
Not that the colonists paid attention to these landmarks. They were too busy exporting Virginia leaf. Obsessed by tobacco, some of the leadership complained, the colonists let Jamestown fall once again into ruin. The church down, the palisado's walls broken, the bridge in pieces, the well of fresh water spoiled, the storehouse they used for the church, the marketplace and streets, and all other spare places planted with tobacco. Massive celebratory drunkenness was common. Incoming ships brought liquor and profitably transformed themselves into floating temporary taverns. Dale was forced to issue an order to Virginia's planters. Grow food crops too, or forfeit your tobacco to the colonial government. Few paid attention.
Are there not passages in the Bible about greed? Are there not passages in the Bible about drunkenness? That doesn't seem to be helping.
Alas, the boom came too late for the Virginia Company. Shipping colonists across the Atlantic only to have them die had exhausted its startup capital. Company officers persuaded London's powerful clergy that helping Jamestown find more investors was the duty of all English Christians. Sunday after Sunday, ministers urged their parishioners to buy shares in the Virginia Company. "Go forward," Reverend William Crashaw urged potential noble and worthy adventurers, some of whom sat in the pews of his Temple Church, one of the nation's most influential houses of worship. If England did not seize its opportunity in Virginia, Crashaw predicted, future generations would ask, why was there such a prize put into the hands of fools who had not hearts to take it? The tactic worked. Ministers enticed more than 700 individuals and companies to put at least £25,000 into the Virginia Company. Equivalents in contemporary money are hard to establish, but this sum surely translates into tens of millions of dollars. Even that vague claim may be misleading, because the pool of investment capital was then much smaller. The capital raised by the Virginia Company was a much bigger percentage of the total available than, say, $50 million would be today. By contrast, historians believe that fewer than a dozen men were the original backers of the company, and that they put in no more than several £100s. The new sum was enough to send over hundreds of colonists, Rolfe and Dale among them, who eagerly grew tobacco. But even the rush of tobacco profits could not offset the debts from the company's years of losses. The Virginia Company was again running out of money on March 22, 1622, when Opechancanough attacked. Early that morning, Indians slipped into European settlements, knocking on doors and asking to be let in. Most were familiar visitors. They came unarmed. Many accepted a meal or a drink. Then they seized whatever implement came to hand, kitchen knife, heavy stew pot, the colonists' own guns, and killed everyone in the house. The assault was brutal, widespread, and well-planned. So swift were the blows that many colonists died without knowing they were under attack. Entire families fell. Houses burned across what had been Sanacomico. At the last minute, several Indians told English friends about the attack, providing enough warning to let Jamestown gather its defenses. Nonetheless, the attackers killed at least 325 people. The aftermath claimed as many as 700 more. Because the attack disrupted spring planting, the Tassantassas grew even less maize than usual. Meanwhile, the company tried to rebuild Jamestown by sending over more than 1,000 new colonists. Incredibly, they were sent with no food supplies. Actually, not so incredibly. Ship captains were paid by the person transported, so they overloaded their vessels with passengers, carrying as little unprofitable food as possible. The luckless, scurvy-ridden souls aboard were dumped ashore, where they were forced to eat barks of trees or molds, soil of the ground.
Is this in keeping with biblical ideas of hospitality and responsibility? Yet it was practiced anyway.
It was a second starving time. Again, colonists scrabbled in rags over handfuls of maize. By spring, the survivors were so debilitated, colony treasurer George Sandys wrote, the living were hardly able to bury the dead. Altogether, about 2 out of every 3 Europeans in Virginia died that year. Not everything went badly for the Tassantassas. In May 1623, a little more than a year after the assault, they staged a counterattack at a peace conference with Senacomaco's leadership. At a celebratory toast, one witness recorded, the English passed out poisoned sack, a sherry-like wine, killing some 200 Indians. Pursued by a stricken, enraged crowd, the colonists fled to their boats. As they left, they fired into the mob, killing some 50 more.
So if a Ten Commandment about slavery would stop it, thou shalt not kill, stop that?
Including, they erroneously believed, Opechancanough. Afterward, the English brought home part of their heads. That is, they scalped some of their victims. By any measure, Opechancanough was in a commanding position. His forces, now more numerous and better supplied than the enemy, they raided English settlements at will. Jamestown's governing council confessed that the colonists couldn't successfully mount a reprisal by reason of their swiftness of foot and advantages of the woods, to which upon all our assaults they retire. Opechancanough predicted in the summer of 1623 that before the end of 2 moons there should not be an Englishman in all their countries. Just as he foresaw, the Virginia Company did not survive. Horrified by the attack, James I created an investigatory commission, which issued a damning report. The company's parliamentary support vanished. Management fought desperately to retain the king's favor. Its investors had sunk into Virginia as much as £200,000, a vast sum at the time. As long as the firm existed, the money potentially could be recouped. If James revoked the company charter, it would be beyond recovery. Nevertheless, he revoked the charter on May 24, 1624. Any responsible monarch would have been obliged to stop the reckless shipment of his subjects to their deaths, wrote Morgan, the historian. The wonder was that the king had not done so earlier. Opechancanough had defeated the Virginia Company. But victory over the company did not mean victory for the Indians. Opechancanough did not launch a final killing assault, pushing the foreigners into the sea. Indeed, a second coordinated attack didn't take place for 22 years, when it was far too late. The reason for his hesitation will never be known with certainty, because English accounts provide the great majority of historical records, and the hostilities ensured that the Tassantassas lost what little view they had into native life. But one possible answer is that Opechancanough had lost Senacomaco before his troops fanned out into English homes. By growing tobacco, the English had transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable.
And I'll stop it there. And it's a great book if you're interested in history. You see, Sam's take on religion doesn't really exist in the real world. Morality is a dynamic, complex engagement with values. It's hardly like finding hydrogen in water. We have a sense of desired outcomes, but we change our minds. Conversion. Pocahontas goes back and forth. English settlers go back and forth. We are looking for orientation. We justify what seems expedient in the search for ends, and we face judgment in outcomes and in reputation. Sam Harris wants to talk about slavery. Well, what he forgets is the communal aspect. He forgets the economic aspect. He forgets all of this. Now, none of this mitigates the moral atrocity that slavery is. But he barely defines slavery and doesn't seriously engage it. And as I said before, we are simply blind to probably what future generations will excoriate us for. Now, I'm not saying that morality is relativistic. I believe in there is such a thing as moral knowledge. But the actual living out and knowing and identifying and picking and choosing is a far more complex thing than Sam Harris seems to indicate by how he approaches this. Did the natives not have a moral norm not to kill? Well, there are many stories where native communities could, on some, at least to the English, seem both more hospitable and more brutal. Well, why? And I'm sure the English looked the same way to the natives. They had different moral values. How did the English justify the killing that they did? Well, it's how we all justify the killing we did. We didn't have a choice. Well, there's a lot that goes under that justification. Law is a tool, and it's a good tool, but it's an insufficient tool. And we, at least on the English side, because they had writing and they had the Bible and they had law and they had a long developed history in Western civilization of moral reasoning. And this is, in fact, way before the height of secularization. Not way before, it's just at the beginning of secularization. But law is an insufficient tool. And I think, in fact, that is part of the message of the Old Testament, that law is unable to, Israel is unable to wield law to bring about the kind of righteousness that God is looking for. It's even, in fact, the kind of righteousness that we look back upon them and judge them for. They undoubtedly, if they could see the other way through history, would have some of their own judgments upon us. Now, Speak Life did a series of videos on some of the, what I think is sort of the stock village atheist objections to Christianity. Old Testament wars, human sacrifice, slavery is condoned. But even the way often Christians present these is this consumer culture that we are blind to, which would probably be greatly evident to the Indians, who probably completely did not understand what was going on with tobacco. As consumers, we pick a source of morality based on our predetermined moral assumptions. And so, in a sense, Sam Harris is saying, see, there's no Ten Commandments that talks about slavery in the Bible. And Christians come back and say, no, and then we have all these reasons for justification. And in fact, often we turn it on the other side. But beneath consumerism, the picture in our head is that individuals, we select a religion. And again, if you watch the N.T. Wright commentary that I made yesterday, even the definition of religion has changed. A religion is now something of a consumer good that we purchase with, sometimes with belief. Older religions will often force people to purchase it with actions, but we purchase it with belief, like we're picking a cell phone. Again, we are imagining a timeless, clean space where we have responsible morality divorced from complex life. What drove the Powhatan and the English to do what they did? It's an enormous, complex framework that even they were likely barely conscious of, just as we are generally barely conscious of ours. And it's often only when we cross a significant religious or cultural line that we can actually begin to see our own religion. We are formed by history, and we're nested in this highly complex matrix and structure that we ourselves are barely aware of. And the less we're aware of it, the more we imagine it's just self-evident to you. You are small and clueless even of yourself, and the kinds of things we're doing for reasons the elephant knows and the riders aren't even all that interested in often. Now, the greatest agency is context and habit. Our desires pull us more than our laws, because, well, a lot of post hoc reasoning goes into a lot of the stories that I just read. With whom will you live? You are shaped by the people that you live with. What stories will you immerse yourself within? Those stories, well, your conscious mind might not know the formation, but the rest of your brain knows the formation. What habits will you pursue or resist? Dallas Willard makes an excellent point on training versus trying. If you want to achieve something like an Olympic gold medal, it's not about trying, it's about training. Well, what is training? Training is about building a regiment of life, what you experience, what you do, what you dedicate yourself to. And this, in fact, shapes the elephant. Now, a big part of the debate between Peterson and Sam Harris will be about stories. And I think Harris, where he seems to acknowledge that stories can be powerful communication devices, I think he's naive in terms of how stories actually get deeply into us. You are a story nested within stories. Rules help transcend story. They're abstractions by which we try to evaluate story, but even rules that seem as plain as thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. We can see those rules get subordinated to story in many ways. Well, normally I won't steal, but we'll take Pocahontas and put her on a boat and send her to England. That's hardly stealing because, after all, we're liberating her from this savagery that she's been exposed to. So it's not really stealing. Well, we're going to poison the Powhatan at a peace conference, but we have no choice. So that's not really killing. Rules are of limited utility. They orient but are still subject to story. Imagining religion as a set of rules is simplistic and facile. Persons finally colonize history. We've seen how unfree or formed we are as persons. Well, why do religions keep getting above nature? Why do religions keep having judgment days? Why do we keep pushing them outside of the time and space world that we're in? And you find this commonly throughout religions. In fact, you'll see, for example, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul is weighed against a feather to see what your judgment will be. Well, why do we conceptualize this? We can get at this from below. And again, this is one thing that Peterson is very good at. They are representations of final summaries. They are crucial for world rule-based orientation. I don't even think that morality, given the limits of the world that Sam Harris is trying to point out, really actually finally works. Without that, all materialists have as a representation of the wrong side of history, and history will judge you. Ooh, my, some person later is going to think ill of me because of the year I was born. I can't live with myself. It finally leads to violence here and now. Miroslav Volf, and I pointed this out in previous videos, Miroslav Volf figured out that secular societies are more prone to atrocity. Why? You must judge the evildoer here and now. If they slip into death, like Stalin, Mao, or Hitler, they escape justice. And what this means is that all those who, because there is not an afterlife, must bring heaven into this world to get your best life now, almost always drag hell in too. Now, looking for heaven in the here and now, you will bring hell. Secularists imagine that a divine book will yield to tyranny here and now because of divine absolutism. Religion is almost never anywhere near that absolute. Sam Harris's picture of religion really doesn't even get religion right. I'd argue that religions with a healthy afterlife and some kind of final judgment actually afford more compromise in the secular realm. It actually manages to relativize even what Sam Harris sees in the Israeli-Palestinian complex as a land contract problem. Post-life, post-heaven and earth, actually allows you to relativize that because you don't have to have all your eggs in this basket. It actually affords more moral flexibility because of religion rather than in spite of it. There is space for judgment. There is space for reward. There is space for a perfect judge, unlike any of us. Because again, if you look at these stories, everybody in these stories had their moral judgment. We have our moral judgment of them, but anyone with any sense of relativism will say, can we really judge them? Can we really judge them fully? Well, I think actually once you start getting into morality and thinking it through, you have, in a sense, an ontological argument necessity to want there to be a judge. Sam Harris judges it this way. Someone else judges it this way. Who decides? History? Well, we, Powhatan, and the Jamestown people are now in history beyond us. We're judging them in a different way that the 1950s judged them, than the 1920s judged them, than the 1850s judged them. So history is a poor judge. What religions, obviously, if you think about it from below, represent is a perfect judge. Well, that's a little bit about morality and some fun stories about the Jamestown colony, and hopefully we'll gain a little bit of perspective on just how complex this whole business is about morality, just how bad we are at it, and why, in fact, I think religions of all kinds, of many kinds, including Christianity, have developed what they've developed. And it isn't irrational. It's actually, if you begin to look at it, it's completely rational, and in fact, I would argue, leads to greater human flourishing than these cheap attacks by Sam Harris and others.